Welcome back. You're still tuned into MF Corner. Let's shift focus to a different topic, but definitely an interesting one. If mutual funds returns are better than rental income or the other way around, and how do these two asset classes compare? To discuss this, we have with us Priti Rathi Gupta, the founder of LXME. Priti, good afternoon. Such a pleasure to have you with us on MF Corner today. And you know, there's always the rent versus buy question, but right now we are going to talk about the mutual fund versus investing in property with rental income. Let's just start with the basics first. What, according to you, is a better bet? What are the pros and cons of both investment avenues?
Hi, Sonal. Always a pleasure to be on a show with you. And this is a particularly interesting topic because when we talk particularly to women, I think the whole question of, property for retirement, property with a rental income, is that a more preferred option than mutual funds, which is even today a fairly less known option of investing when you speak to women. But great question. And I think, I will just come back to one thing. It's very hard to sort of say whether mutual funds or a property with rental income, because you need to take into account a lot of things like, what is your financial goal? How are you looking at liquidity? What is your risk appetite, returns that you may be looking at? And then when it comes to property, also taking into account what are your maintenance costs going to be? And finally, your taxation, right? So I think keeping into mind all of these and what your personal aim for this investment is a very important thing to keep in mind. I think personally, from my experience, and I think, if you just look at returns over the past 20 years, I think it always makes sense to put money into equities for the long term, because one, it has always given you inflation beating returns as opposed to, real estate. And then I think the ability, the flexibility to invest in it, redeem whenever you want to redeem, the liquidity part of it, I think low ticket size, you can start investing with a very small amount. I know today REITs exist, but even within that, today in a mutual fund, you can invest with as little as 100 rupees for a retirement goal. So you can actually begin very, very early into it. And I think essentially mutual funds are professional fund management. So keeping in mind the fact that you have experts who are taking that decisions versus, the only thing that you need to be aware of when you put money into mutual funds is the market volatility. It is market linked, which is true also for real estate. But the volatility in mutual fund in equities are obviously far higher. And I think the other piece is that you don't have, a lot of people feel uncomfortable that I don't have a tangible asset. If I have a property, at least I have something that I can, touch. I know, right? So people feel, okay, this is not tangible enough. And of course, there are certain costs like expense ratio or exit load that you need to keep into account. But real estate, that is far, far higher, right? And really with real estate, I think all those things work, that it is tangible. You can aim for a regular fixed income, but you have to keep into mind that, while you look at the dual benefit of rental income and property appreciation, there are cycles when you may not, when the rent may not, you may have a period when there is no rental income, where you've not been able to let out the property. And of course, property, real estate, as we've seen, goes through very long cycles of the bear phase that we saw over the last 15 years.
Oh, yes. And now we are seeing that up move. But as you said, we've seen a bear cycle as well going on for a long time for the real estate space. But really, since you said it's the physical aspect of holding an asset, which we Indians really like, does this change in terms of age group, the asset class you should be investing in, equity mutual funds versus rental income? Do you see that pattern changing?
I think that pattern definitely is changing. I remember, Sonal, earlier, the minute you started earning, you were told by the family, please go and buy a house, right? Or you would start thinking of property as your sort of investment haven. I think when we see the younger generations, when we look at the Gen Z millennials, firstly, their attachment to property is really not that high. So for them, I think even rent themselves, living on rent is a better option, because it gives them the flexibility to move as per their convenience. Also, I think it works in their benefit, because the younger you are, the earlier you can start investing into equities, you can start with small amounts. So I think they are sort of understanding that power of compounding, which they then can benefit from if they start young. But I think to your point, what we are also seeing is now increasingly, I think people, when we speak to, even people in the age group of their 50s and 60s, are actually still preferring to now for their retirement goals, put in money into um, a mutual fund and then move it to an SWP because they feel that is far more lucrative for them in terms of their retirement expenses or retirement needs.
That is the regular income that you get from mutual funds via systematic withdrawal plan. That makes sense. Preeti, what has the return differential been on commercial property rentals versus mutual funds? If both are invested, say, for a long term, you're not looking at regular income there. What does the math suggest here?
So, Sonal, I think if you look at typically what has been the return on, commercial real estate over the past maybe 20 years, you'll see it in the I think in the range of 6 to 7%. And I'm accounting for the last 20 years. I'm not just saying the last 2 years, because ideally, if it's a long term, you need to take into account what it could be over, the CAGR over the next maybe 20 years. And then if you look at rental income, I think at most you can look at like a 8% yield on that property. So if you take into account that, typically you see that even with the best yields on rent as well as the best returns, you would get a post-tax return of somewhere around 8.5% on real estate, versus even today a 13 or 14% on mutual funds. And if you actually take into account tax and mutual funds, you have the benefit, of course, of even going into a certain amount of tax-free, maybe 1.5 lakhs, which you can take as a tax-free deduction. Even then, I think mutual funds definitely makes for a far better use case for a long-term investment, because you still post-tax will manage to get a 12.5% return as compared to maybe a 6 or 6.5, 7% on real estate.
Makes sense. And it's the post-tax return that we definitely have to look at, right? That eats away a lot of the earnings that we get. But Preeti,
Right.
Thank you so much for joining in today. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you for joining in with your insights and your thoughts.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right. That's all we have of the show today. But stay tuned for Closing Bell to take you through the last hour of trade.